I'm Tucker, and you are in Last Moments. In this video, we're covering the most dark workplace deaths ever recorded. From a worker pulling an alarm and rushing toward a manual shutdown panel to a technician climbing down a ladder to clear a pump blockage. It was March 15th, 2016, when a heated workplace confrontation in a major Midwest city turned deadly, forever changing the lives of two men whose bitter rivalry had been building for months. Clint Harrison, a 34-year-old warehouse supervisor at a mid-sized industrial supply company, was known throughout the facility for his aggressive management style and cruel tendency to publicly humiliate his workers. Standing at 6 feet tall with a commanding presence, Clint ruled his domain with an iron fist, believing that fear and intimidation were the keys to productivity. Martin Webb, 28, operated forklifts on the day shift and had become Clint's primary target over the past 6 months. Webb was a quiet, hard-working family man whose wife was expecting their second child. Despite his stellar safety record spanning 5 years without incident, Clint had systematically written him up for minor infractions, creating a paper trail designed to justify denying Webb a recent promotion to lead operator. Webb's co-workers had witnessed Clint's campaign of harassment, but none dared speak up for fear of becoming targets themselves. The warehouse culture had become toxic under Clint's leadership, with employees walking on eggshells and productivity suffering despite his intimidation tactics. The tension reached a breaking point that Monday afternoon during shift change. Clint had spent the day berating Webb in front of the entire crew, calling him incompetent and threatening termination over a minor paperwork error. As Webb prepared to clock out, Clint cornered him near the loading dock, away from most witnesses. Clint's voice echoed through the empty loading area as he continued his verbal assault, telling Webb he would never amount to anything and that his family would suffer because of his incompetence. He mocked Webb's financial struggles and suggested that maybe his wife would be better off with a real man. When Webb tried to walk away, Clint grabbed his arm and shoved him backward with unnecessary force. In a moment of rage fueled by months of humiliation, Webb grabbed a 3-pound steel pipe wrench from a nearby maintenance cart. Without thinking, driven by pure instinct and overwhelming anger, he swung it at Clint's head with full force. The wrench struck Clint's left temple with a sickening crack, fracturing his skull and causing immediate brain trauma. Clint collapsed instantly, his body hitting the concrete floor with a dull thud as blood began pooling beneath his head. He convulsed briefly, his eyes rolling back before going completely still. The impact had caused a massive subdural hematoma, and Clint died within 2 minutes from severe brain injury and internal bleeding. Webb stood frozen in shock, the wrench still in his trembling hands as he realized what he had done. 2 other employees working nearby had witnessed the entire confrontation and came running when they heard the impact. One immediately called 911, while the other tried unsuccessfully to provide first aid. Webb was arrested and charged with voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, as prosecutors acknowledged the confrontation was not premeditated. During the trial, testimony revealed Clint's systematic pattern of workplace harassment and the mounting financial pressure Webb faced supporting his growing family. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison, citing the tragic circumstances, but noting that violence could never be justified. It was October 12th, 2016, when 38-year-old Garrett Cole arrived at the commercial building's rooftop electrical room to address a critical power issue. An experienced electrical technician with 12 years in the field, Garrett was known for his methodical troubleshooting approach and ability to diagnose complex electrical problems. The morning brought reports of thermal anomalies detected during a routine infrared scan of a breaker feeding rooftop HVAC equipment. Tenant operations created pressure to minimize service interruptions, shifting the scope to energized diagnostics. Nina Alvarez, an observant 20-year-old electrical apprentice, assisted with tools and documentation. Brent O'Keefe, a pragmatic 47-year-old facility manager, had requested minimal service disruption. Isaiah Kent, a cooperative 32-year-old HVAC technician, waited for power verification. The work environment presented several hazardous conditions. Arc-rated personal protective equipment was only partially utilized. Garrett wore a face shield and protective jacket, but had not donned voltage-rated gloves, despite their availability nearby. The dead front cover had been removed from the 480-volt electrical panel, exposing energized conductors. Labeling on the conductors was worn and partially mismatched to the circuit schedule, creating confusion about which circuits corresponded to specific equipment. A digital multimeter with worn probe insulation was selected for voltage measurements. Spare test leads with proper insulation were available, but were not swapped in before beginning diagnostic work. The rooftop environment showed high ambient humidity. Garrett began probing a line-side lug to verify voltage readings. The worn probe insulation failed during contact, and the probe slipped, making contact with an adjacent phase lug in the confined panel space. A phase-to-phase electrical fault initiated immediately. An intense arc flash occurred, producing bright plasma, extreme heat, and a pressure wave that expelled from the panel opening. The electrical discharge created superficial charring on the dead front panel. Garrett sustained severe thermal burns to his hands and face from the arc flash energy. Simultaneously, he experienced an electrical shock with current path across his upper body as the fault current sought ground. The electrical trauma caused him to fall backward onto the concrete floor. Nina immediately pulled him clear using his protective jacket collar and activated the emergency stop for the room's electrical systems. An emergency call was placed to emergency services. An automated external defibrillator was retrieved from the hallway cabinet and applied according to the device's prompts. CPR and defibrillation were initiated while awaiting medical response. Facility staff isolated upstream electrical power to the affected panel and restricted rooftop access to emergency responders only. The electrical room was secured to prevent additional personnel from entering the hazardous area. Emergency medical services transported Garrett to the trauma center, but clinical findings revealed fatal electrocution with associated third-degree burns and cardiac arrhythmia consistent with ventricular fibrillation. The electrical shock had disrupted normal heart rhythm. The investigation cited multiple contributing factors: energized work without proper justification, inadequate personal protective equipment selection, and use of degraded test equipment with compromised insulation. Corrective measures included a strict de-energize unless infeasible policy with documented justification requirements. Glove and test lead inspection checklists became mandatory before electrical work. Panel labeling was updated with accurate circuit identification. Arc flash boundary enforcement procedures were established with proper PPE requirements. Work scheduling was adjusted to allow planned outages with tenant notification and temporary power arrangements. Annual electrical safety qualifications were instituted for energized diagnostic work, with supervisor approval gates. It was September 28, 2018, and the Seattle skyline glowed with warm evening light as Amanda Foster worked alone on the 12th floor of the towering corporate office building. The 20-story structure housed dozens of businesses, its glass facade reflecting the city's bustling energy, even as most employees had long since headed home. Amanda adjusted her reading glasses as she reviewed client presentation materials spread across her desk, her meticulous attention to detail evident in every carefully organized document. At 33, the dedicated office manager had earned a reputation for her thorough knowledge of building operations and emergency procedures, making her the go-to person for safety concerns throughout the corporate complex. The office building had been experiencing recurring problems with its fire suppression system for months, with malfunctioning sprinklers and faulty alarm sensors, creating a patchwork of safety hazards throughout the structure. Amanda had filed multiple detailed reports documenting blocked emergency exits, non-functioning fire doors, and inadequate evacuation lighting, but building management had consistently postponed necessary repairs due to budget constraints. Amanda's role as office manager included coordinating safety procedures for the entire building, a responsibility she took seriously after completing advanced fire safety training the previous year. Her systematic approach to emergency preparedness had identified numerous violations of fire codes, but her warnings had been dismissed by building management as overly cautious concerns. The evening of September 28th found Amanda working late to prepare for an important client presentation scheduled for the following morning. The building's aging electrical system had been showing signs of strain, with flickering lights and occasional power fluctuations. As Amanda reviewed her presentation materials, she noticed an unusual burning smell that seemed to be coming from the building's ventilation system. Her fire safety training immediately triggered concern as she recognized the distinctive odor of electrical components overheating. She quickly saved her work and began investigating the source, following proper protocols by checking nearby electrical panels. The smell intensified as Amanda moved through the 12th floor, leading her to discover smoke beginning to seep through the walls near the main electrical distribution panel. Her training kicked in immediately as she activated the building's fire alarm system and called 911, providing detailed information about the location and nature of the emergency while beginning to evacuate the building. Amanda's knowledge of the building's layout allowed her to quickly identify other late workers who needed to be notified of the emergency. She moved systematically through the floors above and below her location, ensuring that security guards and cleaning staff were aware of the danger and evacuating toward the stairwells. The fire spread rapidly through the building's electrical system, with smoke quickly filling the stairwells due to malfunctioning fire doors that failed to contain the blaze as designed. Amanda found herself trapped in a stairwell filled with thick, toxic smoke as she attempted to guide the last group of workers to safety. Firefighters arrived to find Amanda collapsed just 2 floors from the exit, apparently overcome by smoke inhalation while helping others escape. Despite immediate medical attention, she was pronounced dead at Harborview Medical Center at 9:34 p.m. from smoke inhalation and carbon monoxide poisoning. The fire exposed decades of deferred maintenance and ignored safety violations. Amanda's detailed safety reports became crucial evidence in criminal negligence charges against building management. It was March 4th, 2018. The afternoon heat in Kano's central marketplace pressed down on the crowded auction pavilion, where over 800 people had gathered for a live televised charity fundraiser. Sadiq Musa, a 42-year-old television host, had built his career hosting local fundraising programs for a regional television network, becoming beloved for his animated presentation style and genuine connection with audiences. His background as a former market trader gave him credibility with working-class viewers who trusted his authenticity. For 6 years, he'd specialized in live auction broadcasts that raised money for local schools and medical facilities. Live television auctions in crowded venues present unique challenges, requiring hosts to manage both broadcast timing and crowd dynamics while maintaining energy levels that keep viewers engaged and bidding active. The format demanded constant audience interaction, with hosts frequently moving through crowds to interview bidders and showcase auction items. The network was competing with newer digital platforms for advertising revenue, putting pressure on hosts to create more dynamic content. Sadiq often left the stage to work directly with audience members, a technique that boosted viewer engagement, but required him to navigate dense crowds without assigned security escorts, a practice noted by colleagues as unsafe. His fearless approach to crowd work had become his signature style. That afternoon, the auction pavilion was packed beyond its 600-person maximum capacity, with additional attendees standing in aisles and doorways. Local fire officials had issued warnings about overcrowding, but event organizers ignored maximum occupancy restrictions to maximize fundraising potential. The venue's emergency exits were partially blocked by vendor stalls, reducing evacuation routes. Sadiq noticed the cramped conditions but continued broadcasting, likely trusting that his experience managing crowds would prevent problems. At 3:20 in the afternoon, during a heated bidding sequence for donated livestock, a false report of a structural failure spread through the crowd. The false alarm triggered immediate panic as hundreds of people simultaneously rushed toward the limited exits. Sadiq attempted to restore calm while remaining live on television, but he was quickly pushed into the surging crowd and knocked down within seconds, rather than having the time to intervene safely. His cameramen continued filming from behind and alongside the host, capturing chaotic footage as the crowd surged, partially obscuring Sadiq from view. The crowd's surge pinned Sadiq to the concrete floor almost immediately. Witnesses later reported that he was knocked down and trapped under the surge within seconds, as the crowd surged forward, compressing him against the concrete floor and surrounding bodies. Emergency services were summoned at once by personnel, but ambulances were delayed 18 minutes in reaching the scene because of panicked crowds and obstructed access. Paramedics transported Sadiq to the local hospital, where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival, despite aggressive resuscitation attempts. The coroner determined Sadiq died from compressive asphyxia and multiple blunt force injuries. Sadiq was one of 7 people killed in the stampede, with over 60 others hospitalized for crush injuries. Subsequent investigations highlighted that overcrowding, blocked exits, and lack of on-site security directly contributed to the fatalities, leading to new regulations requiring mandatory crowd control measures and security escorts for television hosts working in dense public gatherings. It was July 22, 2015, when a relentless heat wave gripped the Southwest, pushing temperatures beyond 103 degrees Fahrenheit. The asphalt in a strip mall parking lot radiated waves of heat that distorted the air above its surface. Lila Hart, 29, worked as an assistant manager at a small childcare facility in the strip mall. Known for meticulous attention to detail, Lila had built a reputation for never overlooking safety protocols. 2 weeks earlier, she had filed a formal complaint against a coworker for repeatedly leaving children unattended, resulting in the employee's suspension. That afternoon, Lila parked her dark blue sedan in direct sunlight. Earlier that afternoon, Lila had been temporarily responsible for the 2 toddlers, ages 18 months and 2 years, following an early pickup request. They remained secured in rear-facing car seats when she returned to the strip mall. Exterior security cameras from surrounding businesses captured the parking lot throughout the afternoon. Lila entered the building to complete end-of-shift responsibilities. Inside the air-conditioned building, she worked methodically through her checklist while exterior temperature continued climbing. The sealed vehicle began heating rapidly. Within minutes, interior temperatures surged past 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Subsequent forensic reconstruction determined the children began showing early signs of heat distress within minutes. After approximately 20 minutes, Lila emerged from the building and approached her vehicle, already showing signs of heat stress. The recording showed her fumbling with her key fob and attempting the door handle before staggering beside the driver's door. Her movements became increasingly unsteady as she collapsed onto the superheated asphalt, losing consciousness. The vehicle's driver's side door lock had been deliberately disabled, preventing it from being opened using the key fob. Impaired by heat and sedation, Lila did not attempt alternate entry. Recording continued as heat levels inside reached critical temperatures. The children's movements became more labored as interior temperature climbed toward 140 degrees Fahrenheit. No intervention occurred during the critical window when rescue might have been possible. A customer discovered the scene 25 minutes after Lila's collapse and immediately contacted emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, but found all 3 victims unresponsive. Despite aggressive cooling measures, all were pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined Lila's cause of death was heat-related collapse, complicated by ingestion of a sedating substance that impaired her thermoregulation and mobility. Investigators later determined the sedative had been administered earlier that day through a shared beverage container kept in the staff break area. Toxicology revealed the presence of a sedating compound inconsistent with Lila's medical history. Investigation revealed the suspended co-worker, Carl Smith, 34, had accessed Lila's vehicle using a copied key fob obtained during his employment. Security footage confirmed Smith's presence in the parking lot during lunch hour. During interrogation, inconsistencies in Smith's statements, combined with surveillance footage and forensic evidence, led investigators to determine he had planned to incapacitate Lila and stage a public rescue. He intended to humiliate her professionally while positioning himself as the hero, hoping to get his job back. Smith claimed he was unaware the children were still inside the vehicle and had miscalculated the drug dosage. When he saw Lila collapse, he panicked and fled. Carl Smith was arrested and charged with multiple counts, including second-degree murder and felony manslaughter. He was later convicted and sentenced to multiple life terms in state prison, to be served consecutively. The childcare facility closed permanently. Exterior security footage, vehicle data logs, and forensic findings provided crucial evidence confirming the deliberate nature of the crime. It was August 14, 2014, in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina. Humidity clung to the air as crews arrived before sunrise to prepare a critical beam lift. Streets were closed, traffic diverted, and local news cameras waited across 4th Street, broadcasting the courthouse annex project live that morning. Daniel Brown had supervised construction sites for more than 2 decades, rising from general laborer to site foreman through a mix of technical skill and political leverage. At 47, he still maintained active certifications on heavy equipment, partly out of pride and partly to project authority. Brown was known inside the company for pushing jobs ahead of schedule, often by taking control himself when delays threatened. Since his son, Marcus Brown, 28, joined the company as a rigger 2 years earlier, Brown increasingly treated safety objections as personal challenges rather than operational concerns. The tower crane stood 180 feet tall and was rated for loads up to 12,000 pounds. That morning's lift involved an 8,200-pound steel beam spanning 40 feet. Overnight rain softened the ground, and winds gusted near operator limits. But Brown dismissed concerns and ordered the lift to proceed. Aaron Young, 38, had been a certified crane operator for 11 years before his termination 6 weeks earlier. He was fired after submitting repeated safety complaints involving rigging practices overseen by Marcus Brown. Young documented skipped inspections and improper load handling. Instead of corrective action, he was removed for workplace disruption and escorted off-site. Former co-workers later said Young took the firing personally, viewing it as retaliation that ended his career. In the days leading up to the lift, Young returned to the site after hours under the pretense of collecting personal tools left behind. Investigators later determined that during this access window, the crane's load moment indicator, a system designed to limit swing under unstable conditions, had been deliberately bypassed. The alteration did not prevent operation, but removed a critical safeguard meant to dampen swing under unstable wind conditions. The change was subtle enough to evade routine morning checks. On the morning of the lift, a temporary operator had been scheduled. Shortly before work began, Brown announced he would operate the crane himself, citing familiarity with the site and the presence of media. As the beam was raised and moved laterally over 4th Street, a strong gust struck the suspended load. Without the disabled safeguard compensating for the swing, the oscillation escalated rapidly. Witnesses described the boom whipping sideways as the oscillation intensified. The slewing unit failed, and the upper structure rotated violently before descending. The operator cab dropped toward the street, striking the pavement with catastrophic force. Live news footage captured the cab collapsing inward on impact. Brown remained strapped into the seat as the cab was crushed, pinning his torso against the control panel. Construction workers and pedestrians witnessed the impact. A worker on the ground called 911 at approximately 10:47 a.m. Emergency responders arrived within 12 minutes, but Brown was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner reported multiple rib fractures, massive internal bleeding, and crushing injuries to the chest and abdomen. Death was immediate, caused by traumatic shock and respiratory failure. Toxicology testing was negative. OSHA later cited coastal construction for operating under unsafe wind conditions and for inadequate equipment security. During the investigation, evidence of deliberate tampering emerged. Aaron Young was arrested months later, charged with sabotage and second-degree murder, and later sentenced to federal prison. Marcus Brown resigned and left the industry. The site reopened under new management, with expanded access controls and mandatory end-of-day equipment checks. It was March 8th, 2018, when 31-year-old Laney Price walked into the cold storage distribution facility, assigned to the corridor outside the engine room. Detail-oriented and steady under pressure, she was known for following procedures and stepping in when crews needed a clear head. Her colleagues respected her calm approach to emergency situations. On the floor were a 44-year-old refrigeration technician who favored checklists, a 39-year-old safety coordinator who lived by the manual, and a 28-year-old warehouse lead who kept pallets moving efficiently. The system had problems. A hand valve near the high-pressure receiver had a packing leak on the backlog. Replacement parts were on order. One fixed ammonia detector in the engine room was in bypass for calibration, so a portable meter served as backup. The nearest self-contained breathing apparatus sat in a cabinet 80 feet from the door. with plastic totes stacked too close for quick access. A recent change had moved the emergency shutdown map to a new panel. Not everyone had walked through the update. Wind pushed from the engine room toward the interior dock corridor when the bay doors were open. The release began with a white plume from a valve bonnet on a liquid line, riding a rising hiss that dropped visibility near the floor. The technician's portable alarm spiked, and he moved workers toward muster. Laney pulled the nearest alarm station and headed for the manual shutdown panel inside the corridor to close upstream valves. Vapor drifted into the dock lane, and the warehouse lead signaled crews to move upwind. The safety coordinator called in a hazardous release and began coordinating the response. The cabinet latch for the manual shutdown stuck, misaligned just enough to steal precious seconds. Frost spread along the valve body and nearby piping, creating hazardous conditions. A second detector at the dock threshold was activated. The corridor filled with harsh air that burned exposed skin and airways. Without a respirator, every step closer to the panel cut the exposure margin. The plume thickened, and movement became increasingly difficult. Laney collapsed in the corridor between the engine room door and the shutdown controls, short of the panel by a critical distance. The technician grabbed the breathing apparatus and advanced to the doorway for a rescue attempt. Concentrations drove him back. They waited for hazmat with the area isolated. Fire crews arrived, established hot and cold zones, made an entry under air, and confirmed the manual shutdown while a remote upstream valve was closed. Ventilation fans pulled the cloud out as detectors trended down. Laney was brought to the cold zone, where responders provided high-flow oxygen and advanced life support. Clinical findings documented acute inhalation injury from anhydrous ammonia, with airway edema and hypoxia that proved fatal. The distance, wind direction, stuck latch, and lack of immediate respiratory protection combined against her. Investigation identified critical failures: detector on bypass without backup coverage, blocked access to breathing gear, manual-only shutdown too far from the hazard, unresolved valve leak, and bay doors directing releases toward occupied areas. Corrective actions included redundant fixed detection, relocated breathing apparatus with clear access, remotely actuated shutdowns with mapped pull stations, priority repairs for pressure leaks, and door management rules. Crews began drilling ammonia-specific scenarios with upwind egress routes, valve trains were retagged for clarity, and pre-incident plans with valve maps were provided to local responders. It was March 12, 2014, and fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sprawling automotive parts manufacturing plant in Detroit, Michigan. The 200,000-square-foot facility buzzed with rhythmic sounds of heavy machinery as the night shift worked to meet an impossible deadline. The smell of machine oil and hot metal filled the air, mixing with tension that had been building for weeks as management pushed for record production numbers. Carlos Mendoza adjusted his safety glasses one final time as he surveyed the massive hydraulic press that had become his domain over 8 years of dedicated service. At 34, the experienced machine operator had earned respect through his meticulous attention to detail and unwavering commitment to safety protocols. His calloused hands told the story of countless hours spent coaxing maximum efficiency from temperamental machinery, while never compromising on worker protection. The promotion to senior machine operator had come with additional responsibilities that Carlos embraced wholeheartedly. He spent his breaks training new employees on proper safety procedures, emphasizing the importance of following protocols even when supervisors pressured them to take shortcuts. His wife Maria often joked that he cared more about his co-workers' safety than his own, a trait that made him beloved among factory workers. Recent months had brought increasing pressure from the front office as the plant struggled to fulfill a massive contract with a major automotive manufacturer. Safety inspectors had documented several minor violations during routine visits, but necessary repairs had been consistently delayed due to budget constraints and relentless focus on meeting deadlines. Carlos had grown increasingly concerned about shortcuts being encouraged by supervisors desperate to avoid production delays. The night shift on March 12th began like countless others, with Carlos methodically checking his equipment and reviewing safety protocols with his team. The massive hydraulic press, capable of generating 2,000 tons of crushing force, had been experiencing intermittent jamming issues that required frequent clearing. Company policy mandated complete shutdown before any maintenance work, but supervisors had been quietly encouraging workers to clear minor jams while machines remained operational. As the shift progressed, the familiar sound of the hydraulic press suddenly changed, indicating another jam in the feeding mechanism. Carlos approached the machine with practiced efficiency, his 8 years of experience allowing him to quickly diagnose the problem. The jam appeared minor, the type that could be cleared in seconds if he could just reach the stuck material without initiating the full shutdown sequence. Carlos glanced around the factory floor, noting the supervisor's expectant gaze and pressure to maintain production targets. Against his better judgment and years of safety training, he decided to attempt clearing the jam while the machine continued its cycle. He reached toward the feeding mechanism, his loose sleeve catching on a protruding bolt as he stretched to dislodge the stuck material. In an instant, the fabric pulled tight and drew his arm into the machinery's relentless grip. Carlos's scream of terror echoed across the factory floor as co-workers watched in horror, their shouts mixing with mechanical sounds of the press continuing its programmed cycle. Several workers frantically hit emergency stops, but the massive machine's momentum carried it through several more crushing cycles before finally grinding to a halt. Carlos was pronounced dead at Detroit General Hospital at 2:47 a.m., leaving behind a wife and 2 young children. The factory was immediately shut down by OSHA investigators who uncovered a pattern of safety violations. Carlos's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit that revealed management's systematic prioritization of production over worker safety. It was June 2nd, 2022, in Mapleton, Illinois. The morning sun cast long shadows over the Caterpillar foundry, where workers moved through the massive industrial complex, their bodies already coated in a thin layer of metallic dust. Inside, the air was thick with heat and the scent of burning iron. Molten metal glowed in open crucibles, their contents heated to 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit, ready to be cast into heavy machinery components. The facility, one of the largest foundries in the country, could melt up to 1,000 tons of iron daily. The work was dangerous, requiring extensive training, but despite the scale of the operation, safety measures were not always in place. Stephen Dirks, 39, had been at the foundry for only 9 days. A father of 3, he lived in Peoria, Illinois, with his partner, Jessica Sutter, and their daughters, aged 4, 5, and 12. He had taken the job after a period of unemployment, hoping to provide a stable future for his family. The foundry was demanding, but he was willing to endure the long hours and extreme conditions. He trusted that the risks were manageable, unaware that this very trust would soon cost him everything. That fateful day at 9:20 a.m., Stephen was assigned a routine task, taking a sample of molten iron. The process required precision. A crucible, filled to the brim with liquid metal, sat before him. The metal swirled and shimmered, its temperature capable of reducing solid matter to nothing in seconds. There were no guardrails around the platform where he worked, only open space and the edge of the crucible, just inches away. Then something went wrong. Stephen took a step, but his foot did not find stable ground. He tripped, his balance lost in an instant. With no barrier to stop him, he fell forward. His upper body plunged into the crucible. The reaction was immediate. The extreme heat vaporized flesh and bone on contact, consuming Stephen in a fraction of a second. The crucible hissed violently as his body was absorbed into the molten mass. By the time his co-workers realized what had happened, it was already too late. The foundry fell silent. Workers stared, frozen by the horror of what they had just witnessed. A call was made to the Peoria County Coroner's Office. By 10 a.m., authorities arrived, but there was little to recover. The facility was evacuated, and work was halted for the day. Hours later, after the contents of the crucible had cooled, the coroner's team sifted through the remains. They found only fragments, small pieces of bone, the last traces of Stephen Dirks. The official cause of death was listed as thermal annihilation. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration launched an investigation. Inspectors noted the absence of guardrails and protective barriers at the workstation. The foundry, with its massive output, required careful safety precautions, but hazards were present. Just 6 months earlier, another worker, Scott Adams, had also died at the facility. Employees later voiced their concerns, describing grueling conditions and safety lapses that had been ignored. Despite this, Caterpillar maintained that worker safety was a priority. OSHA determined that Stephen's death could have been prevented. The agency issued a fine of $145,027, the maximum allowed under federal law. However, no criminal charges were filed. Some criticized the decision, arguing that smaller companies often face harsher consequences, while large corporations like Caterpillar avoid serious legal repercussions. Jessica Sutter grieved in silence. Her daughters would never see their father again. She held Caterpillar responsible, believing that a simple safety measure could have saved Stephen's life. In the weeks that followed, she waited for answers, for accountability, but none came. Caterpillar did not offer assistance to her or her children. The foundry continued to operate. The furnaces remained lit, and the molten iron flowed as it always had. The tragedy of Stephen Dierkes faded into the machinery of industry, reduced to a fine layer of dust, settling unnoticed on the factory floor. It was May 14, 2014. The morning air at a small regional wildlife park in the Moravian Silesian region of the Czech Republic carried the familiar scent of hay and animal musk, as staff prepared for what should have been a routine educational broadcast. Marek Dolezal, 41, had spent 12 years as a zookeeper before transitioning to television work 3 years earlier. His show, broadcast on local regional networks, focused on wildlife education with a personal touch that set him apart from polished nature documentaries. The zoo's insurance company had recently tightened restrictions on media access, specifically discouraging live broadcasts involving direct enclosure entry. But Marek's history as former staff allowed him special privileges that bypassed several newer safeguards. Large ungulates like the European bison require specialized handling protocols due to their unpredictable nature and massive size. Even experienced keepers maintain safe distances and never turn their backs on these powerful animals, whose territorial instincts can trigger sudden aggressive behavior without warning. Direct, unsupervised human presence inside an active bison enclosure is normally prohibited under modern zoo safety standards. That morning segment was designed to demonstrate proper visitor behavior around large hoofed animals. The production team had chosen the bison enclosure specifically because Marek had worked with this particular animal for years. The segment was airing live on a regional morning television program with no broadcast delay, as the production team followed Marek into the enclosure. However, recent budget cuts had reduced staffing, and the usual safety coordinator was absent. A second keeper assigned as a spotter had been pulled away to cover another enclosure, leaving Marek alone. Weather conditions were optimal, but the animal had been agitated earlier due to construction noise from nearby renovations that the zoo administration had failed to postpone. The plan called for Marek to enter the main enclosure alone, positioning himself near the primary gate while explaining safe observation techniques. The entry was a procedural violation that went unchallenged due to Marek's seniority and the pressure of a live broadcast schedule. However, maintenance workers had used the secondary service gate earlier that morning to deliver fresh bedding, and although the latch appeared engaged at a glance, debris prevented it from fully seating. Cameras rolled as Marek entered the enclosure. The 2,200-pound bison initially remained calm, grazing near the far wall while Marek explained proper body posture to viewers. Confident in his experience, he gradually moved closer to demonstrate how humans should position themselves to appear non-threatening. This approach contradicted the advice he was verbally giving, but it was subtle enough that no one intervened. As he spoke, Marek slowly backed toward what he believed was the secured secondary gate, unaware that it stood slightly ajar behind him. Without warning, the bison's demeanor shifted. The animal raised its massive head, snorted once, and charged directly at Marek with devastating speed. Live television viewers watched in horror as the 2,200-pound animal struck him squarely in the torso, ramming him backward with its head and chest, and driving his body through the partially open gate as it flexed inward. Marek hit the concrete service area hard, his legs twisted at unnatural angles. Momentum carried the bison partially into the threshold, where it pinned and trampled Marek with repeated crushing blows. The camera operator froze in shock as staff members screamed off camera. The live feed cut abruptly mid-scream as the broadcast director realized what was happening. On-site zoo emergency staff reached the scene within 90 seconds, using emergency protocols to drive the animal back into the enclosure and secure the gates. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, but Marek had already succumbed to his injuries. The coroner's report determined that Marek died from massive internal trauma, caused by multiple blunt force impacts. Marek's archived episodes were quietly removed from broadcast rotation, and his family received an undisclosed settlement from the zoo's insurance company. It was November 11, 2013 in Laredo, Texas, inside a small auto repair shop along a border service road. Mild weather kept the bay doors open and radios playing as customers came and went. The evening felt routine, with nothing on the surface suggesting the strain that had been building behind the scenes. The tension focused on Miguel Santos, who was 40 and known as the guy the shop leaned on when work ran late. He stayed after hours, followed the rules, and handled repairs others didn't want. Outside the shop, he picked up overtime and coached youth soccer to support his infant twin daughters. That balance fell apart after he reported a co-worker, Daniel Jones, 38, for stealing tools and selling them off-site. Management confirmed the theft and issued a warning, and from then on, the atmosphere in the shop changed. The argument started soon after. Daniel accused Miguel of snitching and costing everyone money. Other mechanics overheard shouting near the tool cages and service bays. Managers tried to keep them on separate shifts, but short staffing meant they still crossed paths. Security cameras recorded several heated encounters in the weeks before the incident, including one where Daniel told Miguel he would regret it. On Veterans Day evening, Miguel stayed late to finish a suspension repair on a luxury SUV. Most of the staff had already left. Daniel remained on the clock in a nearby bay, assigned routine cleanup. Security cameras showed Miguel lifting the SUV and positioning himself underneath to secure the final bolts. The lift arms were correctly set, the safety locks engaged, and the vehicle was stable. At 8:56 p.m., Daniel walked into Miguel's bay without speaking. Miguel continued working beneath the vehicle, focused on the suspension. Daniel stood near the control column for several seconds, watching. Then, without any exchange or warning, he reached out, pulled the safety lock release, and held the hydraulic control down. The lift dropped immediately. With the safety locks released, the SUV dropped several feet. Miguel screamed as the chassis slammed onto his chest and shoulders. The impact crushed his rib cage inward, forced the air from his lungs, and pinned him to the concrete. Blood spread beneath his body as his legs kicked and scraped against the floor, then slowed. Daniel stepped back, froze for a moment, then turned and ran out of frame. The vehicle continued to settle unevenly, fully trapping Miguel beneath it. His arms were pinned, his head pressed sideways against the concrete. His mouth opened and closed as his chest failed to rise. His legs twitched briefly, then went still as all movement stopped. At 9:18 p.m., a passerby noticed blood pooling under the bay door and called 911. Paramedics arrived 11 minutes later and found Miguel unresponsive, chest compressed beneath the SUV. Additional lifting equipment was required to raise the vehicle. Miguel went into cardiac arrest during extrication and was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as crush asphyxia due to massive chest compression, which collapsed both lungs and prevented oxygen from reaching the heart. Investigators reviewed the footage and confirmed the lever had been intentionally engaged while Miguel was underneath the vehicle. Daniel Jones was arrested and charged with murder, a first-degree felony. He was later convicted and sentenced to 60 years in state prison. The shop closed within 6 months amid criminal proceedings and civil lawsuits. Miguel's twin daughters were raised with the help of extended family. It was May 22, 2016, when 42-year-old Rebecca Sloan began her shift on the facade restoration scaffold of a downtown commercial building. An experienced restoration specialist with 15 years in the trade, Rebecca was known for her meticulous craftsmanship and steady nerves working at height. Her colleagues respected her expertise in historical building preservation and her calm approach to complex restoration challenges. The morning briefing was cut short to take advantage of clearing weather conditions. Strong winds were forecasted for later, creating urgency to complete critical work. Jordan Hale, an eager 24-year-old apprentice, assisted Rebecca with material counts and tool organization. Safety consultant Priya Shah, a thorough 51-year-old professional, was scheduled for midday inspection. Lewis Grant, the cautious 33-year-old hoist operator, maintained his position near the material lift, known for calling out deck movements. The scaffold system showed several concerning deficiencies. A mid-rail section and crossbrace were missing from a corner bay, awaiting delayed replacement parts. The gap created a dangerous opening in the fall protection system at a critical location where workers frequently passed. Rebecca wore her safety harness, but remained unconnected to any tie-off point while moving along the deck to inspect repointing work. Available overhead anchor points went unused as she focused on examining facade joints near the mast tie connection. A temporary power cable ran across the walking surface, secured with tape that had begun lifting due to foot traffic. The raised edge created a trip hazard that had been noted but not corrected. The material hoist hatch remained open for deliveries. Deck planks near the opening had been repositioned but were not properly secured with safety pins. Rebecca advanced along the outer deck toward the corner bay, where the missing mid-rail created an unprotected edge. Her boot contacted the lifted power cable tape, causing her to adjust stance and shift weight onto the loose plank near the hoist opening. The unsecured plank shifted laterally under her weight. As she attempted to regain balance with a heel-to-toe step, the movement created a gap in the decking. A coil of sling line briefly caught her foot before releasing, adding momentum toward the unprotected edge. Without the missing mid-rail to arrest her lateral motion, and no active tie-off connection, Rebecca cleared the guard height and fell approximately 28 feet. During descent, she struck a lower scaffold ledger, causing rotation before impacting the concrete slab near the hoist mast base. Co-workers immediately initiated emergency calls while clearing the hoist area and retrieving trauma response equipment. The scaffold deck was secured with caution tape to prevent further incidents and maintain clear access for emergency responders. Emergency medical services arrived to find non-survivable blunt force trauma with severe head and chest injuries. The impact forces from the 28-foot fall onto concrete had caused injuries incompatible with life. Site operations ceased immediately. The scaffold system was tagged out and later rebuilt with full guardrail systems, properly pinned planking, and corrected cross-bracing. The investigation cited multiple contributing factors: lack of tie-off during movement, missing mid-rail protection, unsecured deck planks, and inadequate housekeeping procedures. Implemented controls included mandatory tie-off during all deck movement, daily plank pin verification, proper cable routing away from walkways, and specific wind hold criteria. A safety brief was conducted citywide for similar projects, emphasizing fall protection requirements at hoist interfaces. It was August 7, 2015, and the Miami sun blazed mercilessly over the construction site where a 30-story luxury condominium complex was slowly taking shape against the azure sky. The sound of heavy machinery mixed with workers' voices as the day shift pushed to make up for weeks of weather delays that had put the project dangerously behind schedule. Concrete dust hung in the humid air, and the smell of fresh cement mixed with the salt breeze from nearby Biscayne Bay. Michael O'Brien wiped sweat from his forehead as he surveyed the 15th floor from his position near the freshly poured concrete section. At 41, the experienced construction foreman had spent over 2 decades building Miami's skyline, earning a reputation for uncompromising attention to safety and quality workmanship. His weathered hands and sun-damaged skin told the story of countless hours spent ensuring that every beam, every pour, and every connection met the highest standards. The luxury condominium project represented the pinnacle of Michael's career, a $200 million development that would house Miami's elite in 400 exclusive units. Recent weather delays had created immense pressure from developers who faced penalty clauses and angry investors, if the project missed its completion deadline. Michael had been working 12-hour shifts for 3 weeks straight, trying to coordinate multiple crews while maintaining the safety standards that had kept his workers injury-free for over 5 years. Recent inspections had raised concerns about the concrete curing process, with some sections showing signs of premature stress under the accelerated construction schedule. Michael had documented his concerns in detailed reports to project managers, but work continued under increasingly tight deadlines as financial pressures mounted. The morning of August 7th began with Michael's usual safety briefing, emphasizing the importance of proper procedures despite mounting pressure to accelerate work. The 15th floor concrete pour had been completed the previous day, and workers were preparing to begin steel placement for the next level. Michael noticed unusual stress patterns in the concrete below, hairline cracks that shouldn't have appeared so early in the curing process. As Michael inspected the questionable concrete section more closely, his experienced eye detected signs of imminent structural failure. The cracks were spreading rapidly, indicating that the concrete hadn't achieved sufficient strength to support the loads being placed on it. He immediately grabbed his radio and began coordinating an emergency evacuation of all workers from the affected floors. Michael's voice echoed across the construction site as he directed workers toward the stairwells and construction elevators, his 20 years of experience allowing him to quickly assess the scope of the danger. He remained on the 15th floor to ensure that every worker had been accounted for, personally checking each work area to confirm complete evacuation. Before the evacuation could be completed, a section of the floor collapsed with a thunderous roar that could be heard for blocks. Michael and 2 other workers fell through the failing concrete, their bodies disappearing into a cascade of debris that triggered a domino effect through multiple floors below. Rescue workers labored for 6 hours to extract victims from the twisted metal and concrete debris, but Michael's injuries from the 150-foot fall proved fatal. He was pronounced dead at Jackson Memorial Hospital at 4:23 p.m., having saved the lives of 12 workers through his quick thinking and selfless actions. The construction site was permanently closed, and the partially built structure demolished. Michael's heroic actions were recognized by the city, and a scholarship was established for construction safety education in his memory. It was October 20th, 2017 in Stary Oskol, Russia. The Slavyanka confectionery factory hummed with the noise of large industrial mixers and the clatter of workers carrying out their daily tasks. Among them was 36-year-old Natalia Nemetz, a dedicated mother of a 10-year-old son named Ivan. For Natalia, the factory was more than just a job. It was a source of pride, a place where she could support her family and provide for her son. But that day, something went terribly wrong. Natalia was assigned the task of cleaning one of the factory's large mixers, a crucial piece of equipment in the caramel production line. The tank, over 6 feet deep and wide, was filled with thick, boiling caramel. She had done the task countless times before, but this time, the situation turned tragic. At some point during her work, Natalia fell into the open tank. The heat of the caramel was intense, over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was designed to stir with rotating blades, making escape impossible. Worse still, the flow of the caramel, which had been momentarily shut off, began to surge again, filling the tank. By the time her colleagues noticed her absence, it was too late. There were no cries for help, no sound at all. The only indication of her fate was the sight of her legs sticking out from the tank, the rest of her body submerged in the thick molten liquid. The factory went quiet. Workers stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the horror before them. Despite their panic, nothing could be done. Natalia had been boiled alive, her death instantaneous, caused by the extreme temperature of the caramel. The blades in the tank ensured that there was no chance for survival, making it a freak accident no one could have anticipated. News of the incident spread quickly, but management immediately moved to suppress any details from leaking. Workers were threatened with dismissal if they spoke out, and any attempt at communication was swiftly blocked. However, the truth eventually surfaced. A local paper, Komsomolskaya Pravda, reported the horrific accident, which was followed by a formal investigation. The investigation revealed disturbing details. It wasn't the first fatal incident at the factory. This was the third such event within a year, raising questions about safety practices at Slavianka. Workers speculated that Natalia might have fainted from the overwhelming heat before falling into the tank. Others believed it was a simple accident. She stumbled and fell in without warning. Either way, the lack of proper safety measures in place became glaringly obvious. Even more troubling was the factory's response. Despite the horror of the accident, the management sought to cover up what had happened. Employees were warned to remain silent, and those who dared to speak risked losing their jobs. The callous disregard for safety and the attempted concealment of the tragedy only deepened the community's outrage. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this was not a one-off incident. The factory had a troubling history of accidents, and management had failed to ensure the well-being of its workers. Natalia's death was a grim reminder that industrial workplaces can be dangerous when corners are cut. Her son, Ivan, now orphaned, was taken in by Natalia's sister, Yulia. The factory, the authorities, and the town would have to come to terms with the fact that such a simple task, cleaning a tank, could lead to a death so senseless and tragic. In the wake of her passing, the town of Stary Oskol was left to grapple with the realization that something as routine as cleaning a mixer could result in the loss of a mother and a life. It was February 2nd, 2016. The Atlantic winds swept across the volcanic cliffs of a remote Canary Island overlook, with deceptive calm, carrying salt spray and the promise of an approaching storm system that would claim a life before evening. Elena Mariana Mendez, 29, had spent 3 years covering routine weather segments from the safety of studio green screens, desperately seeking opportunities to demonstrate her capabilities as a field correspondent. Her colleagues described her as determined, but inexperienced in dangerous field conditions, often volunteering for assignments others avoided to build her reputation. Coastal cliff reporting presents unique challenges where sudden crosswind and downslope gusts can create unpredictable forces exceeding 60 miles per hour. Professional field reporters typically use safety harnesses and work with experienced crews who understand environmental hazards, but Elena's network operated on limited budgets with minimal safety protocols. That morning, Elena received an assignment to cover an approaching Atlantic storm system from one of the Canary Islands' exposed clifftop overlooks. The network scheduled the segment as a live field report, broadcast in real time from the clifftop as the storm approached. The segment was designed to showcase the raw power of approaching weather, with producers specifically requesting dramatic visuals of Elena reporting against strong winds. Meteorological services had issued wind advisories warning of gusts up to 70 miles per hour, but network executives pressured Elena to proceed, emphasizing the competitive advantage of live cliffside coverage despite escalating conditions. Elena arrived at the location wearing standard business attire and worn, smooth, leather-soled dress shoes, carrying only a handheld microphone and earpiece. The clifftop overlook had no safety barriers, just a narrow ledge of volcanic rock overlooking a 120-foot drop to jagged coastline below. Her cameraman expressed concerns about the deteriorating conditions, hesitating alongside her as gusts grew stronger, but both ultimately deferred after producers reiterated their instructions over the earpiece. As the live broadcast began, wind speeds were already approaching dangerous levels. Elena positioned herself within 6 feet of the cliff edge, struggling to maintain composure as gusts whipped her jacket and forced her to widen her stance for stability. Producers, monitoring from the studio, encouraged her to move closer to the edge for more dramatic footage, prompting visible hesitation from both Elena and the cameraman as conditions worsened. A sudden, violent crosswind gust struck the clifftop with devastating force. Elena staggered sideways, her microphone scraping against volcanic rock as she fought for balance. The live camera captured her losing footing on the uneven stone as she slipped toward the edge, followed by a sudden spike in audio distortion before the feed cut away. Acting quickly, the cameraman left his filming gear and called for help from the cliff, though the remote terrain kept rescue personnel from arriving for 45 minutes. Specialized cliff rescue units rappelled down the rock face, locating Elena's body on the jagged coastline below. She had suffered massive blunt force trauma from the approximately 120-foot fall, including skull fractures, spinal breaks, and internal organ rupture, with injuries described as non-survivable upon impact. The incident prompted immediate investigations into field reporting safety standards. Elena's family filed wrongful death lawsuits against the television network, citing inadequate safety protocols and reckless endangerment, ultimately reaching confidential settlements. It was May 14, 2016. Humid air hung over a Midwest subdivision as crews prepared work around an 8-foot excavation. Reed Foster, 41, had 15 years in residential construction. As site supervisor, he was methodical and safety-focused. 3 weeks earlier, he had fired concrete foreman Mark Delano after a heated confrontation over overtime pay demands. During the termination meeting, Delano made threatening statements about making Reed pay for the firing. Security cameras captured the exchange, and witnesses later testified to the threats. Following his termination, Mark Delano sent increasingly hostile text messages to Reed's phone. The messages escalated from complaints about destroyed livelihood to surveillance threats and references to construction site accidents. Reed had reported the threats to his supervisor but hadn't involved the police. The morning's concrete pour was scheduled for 6:30 a.m., requiring 80 cubic yards. A security camera recorded the work zone continuously. At 6:42 a.m., footage clearly showed Mark Delano removing 2 diagonal bracing boards from the eastern wall, supports critical to stabilizing that section of the excavation under load. Despite being terminated, Delano had retained his hard hat and safety vest. With the early morning start and minimal supervision on site, he was able to blend in with the crew without being immediately challenged. He systematically removed the critical support beams before leaving. Reed descended alone to inspect rebar placement, a routine check before major pours. Above, the concrete truck's chute extended over the excavation. Reed carried his standard inspection clipboard. Unaware that the excavation's structural integrity had been compromised, Reed continued his inspection moments before the concrete pour was scheduled to begin. Loose soil and debris from the collapsing wall surged around his boots, pinning his legs against the rebar. The eastern wall collapsed without warning. Unsupported soil cascaded inward, striking Reed's legs and pelvis with tremendous force. The impact pinned his lower body against rebar as tons of compacted earth continued pouring in, trapping him completely. In the seconds following the collapse, the concrete pour continued momentarily, before workers recognized the failure. With slurry already flowing into the compromised excavation, concrete was poured into the collapsed trench, compounding the soil burial and increasing the crushing pressure against Reed's lower body. The mixture's density created crushing pressure as he struggled unsuccessfully to free himself. Reed's movements became increasingly restricted as compacted soil and concrete slurry compressed his torso. Combined soil and concrete weight crushed his ribcage, making breathing increasingly difficult. His struggles only drove him deeper as the mixture continued rising around his shoulders. The weight became unbearable as the mixture rose high against his upper torso. Security footage showed Reed becoming motionless as rising concrete and compacted soil compressed his chest and airway. The pour continued for several seconds before workers noticed something was wrong and shouted for the truck to stop. Crew members rushed toward the excavation. Emergency crews arrived within 12 minutes, but the concrete had already begun stiffening, complicating rescue efforts. Recovery required jackhammers and cutting equipment. Reed was extracted after 47 minutes, but resuscitation efforts failed. The coroner determined death by compressive asphyxia with blunt force trauma. Security footage confirmed deliberate bracing removal caused the structural failure. Cell phone records placed Mark Delano at the construction site during the sabotage window, contradicting his alibi. After a 6-month investigation, Mark Delano was arrested and charged under a premeditated homicide statute. During the trial, prosecutors presented the threatening text messages, security footage, and witness testimony. Delano was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The court cited overwhelming evidence of premeditation and intent, concluding that the killing resulted from a deliberate act carried out after a workplace grievance. It was August 14, 2018, when 31-year-old Cassie Donovan arrived for her evening shift at the regional distribution warehouse. A dedicated logistics coordinator with 7 years of experience, Cassie was known for her precise attention to loading procedures and ability to maintain efficiency under pressure. Her methodical approach earned respect from colleagues. Andre Lewis, a 27-year-old forklift operator praised for his precise approach speeds, was assigned to door 12. Ruth Park, a direct 45-year-old yard coordinator, managed staging multiple trailers simultaneously. Eli Roberts, a fast-paced 22-year-old temporary worker, focused on stacking pallets inside the trailer with checklist-driven precision. Several mechanical issues created dangerous conditions at door 12. The vehicle restraint system displayed "not engaged," with an open maintenance ticket unaddressed. The hydraulic dock leveler suffered from a slow bleed that caused the lip to settle unpredictably under load, creating unstable gaps. Wheel chocks remained stored rather than deployed under trailer wheels. The yard coordinator managed multiple trailer movements, prioritizing speed over securing procedures. Lighting at the threshold was compromised by a burned-out fixture, creating shadows that obscured the critical gap area between dock and trailer. Radio traffic increased as dispatch called for expedited loading to meet delivery deadlines. The compressed turnaround times added pressure to the complex operation, involving multiple personnel and moving equipment in a confined space. Cassie positioned herself at the dock edge to visually confirm proper alignment between the trailer bed and dock lip. This manual verification was standard when mechanical indicators failed to provide reliable feedback about trailer positioning and safety status. Eli moved to the trailer front to square the first pallet, while Andre approached slowly with his forklift. The yard coordinator's tractor contacted the trailer during final positioning, causing the unsecured trailer to inch forward without restraints or chocks to prevent movement. The gap between dock face and trailer widened as the vehicle drifted. The compromised leveler lip partially retracted due to hydraulic bleed, creating an uneven transition zone. Cassie found herself in the pinch zone as the trailer moved unpredictably back and forth. Andre's forklift mast approached the threshold, with obstructed sight lines due to load height and shadowed lighting. The trailer rolled back toward the dock with a rebound motion, trapping Cassie between the trailer's rear frame and solid dock edge with crushing force. Andre immediately stopped and reversed his forklift. The leveler dropped further due to hydraulic failure, complicating extraction from the dangerous pinch point. The compression forces were instantaneous and severe, causing immediate trauma. Emergency response was called immediately. Nearby loading bays were halted and dock plates raised to prevent additional trailer movement. First aid responders applied oxygen while awaiting emergency medical services arrival. Emergency medical personnel performed advanced life support, but clinical findings revealed fatal crush injuries to the chest and pelvis with internal hemorrhaging. The compression forces between the heavy trailer and immovable dock structure caused non-survivable trauma. The facility underwent comprehensive safety upgrades. All docks were retrofitted with functioning vehicle restraint systems and mandatory wheel chock procedures. Interlocked green and red light systems provided clear visual confirmation of trailer security. New procedures established dedicated spotter positions during trailer alignment. Threshold lighting was repaired and upgraded throughout the facility. A dock hazard audit program was implemented with weekly inspections and documented sign-offs. It was November 23, 2016, and the pre-dawn darkness enveloped the sprawling petrochemical processing facility in Houston, Texas. The complex of towers, pipes, and storage tanks stretched across 500 acres, their lights twinkling like industrial constellation against the Gulf Coast sky. The smell of petroleum products and chemical compounds hung heavy in the humid air, as the night shift monitored the continuous processes that never stopped, even on Thanksgiving morning. Dr. Jennifer Park adjusted her hard hat as she completed her rounds through the facility's control room, her clipboard filled with detailed notes about pressure readings and temperature variations. At 38, the brilliant chemical engineer had dedicated her career to ensuring the safe operation of processes that could turn deadly in seconds, if not properly managed. Her PhD in chemical engineering from MIT had prepared her for the technical challenges, but her natural instinct for safety had made her invaluable to the facility's operations. The petrochemical plant processed thousands of barrels of crude oil daily, transforming raw materials into the plastics, solvents and chemicals that formed the backbone of modern industry. Jennifer's role involved overseeing safety protocols for equipment that operated under extreme pressures and temperatures, with some reactors containing compounds volatile enough to level city blocks if released improperly. Recent months had brought increasing concern as Jennifer identified potential safety hazards in the facility's aging equipment. Her detailed reports recommended immediate upgrades to pressure relief systems and emergency shutdown mechanisms, but management had consistently delayed the costly improvements due to budget constraints and quarterly profit pressures. Jennifer had been working overtime to develop temporary safety measures while waiting for equipment replacements that seemed perpetually postponed. The facility's reactor Unit 7 had been showing irregular pressure fluctuations for weeks, a pattern that Jennifer's experience told her indicated potential seal failures in the high-pressure containment system. She had recommended taking the unit offline for comprehensive inspection, but production managers argued that the temporary shutdown would cost millions in lost revenue during the peak demand season. As Jennifer began her Thanksgiving morning inspection, the readings from Reactor Unit 7 showed pressure spikes that exceeded normal operating parameters. Her training and instincts immediately recognized the signs of impending catastrophic failure, and she initiated emergency shutdown procedures while simultaneously ordering evacuation of all personnel from the affected area. The emergency shutdown process required manual operation of several critical valves that could only be accessed from within the reactor building. Jennifer's colleagues urged her to evacuate with them, but she knew that someone had to remain to ensure all safety systems were properly activated. Her detailed knowledge of the facility's systems made her the only person capable of executing the complex shutdown sequence quickly enough to prevent a larger disaster. As Jennifer worked frantically to isolate the failing reactor, the containment system suffered catastrophic failure, releasing thousands of pounds of volatile chemicals in an explosive fireball that could be seen for miles. The blast wave shattered windows in buildings throughout the industrial district and triggered evacuations across southeast Houston. Jennifer was found at her post, having remained to ensure all safety systems were activated before attempting to escape. She was pronounced dead at the scene, her sacrifice having prevented a disaster that could have killed hundreds and contaminated thousands of acres. Federal investigators found that deferred maintenance and ignored safety recommendations directly contributed to the disaster. A research center for industrial safety was established in Jennifer's honor, focusing on preventing similar tragedies. It was September 30th, 1999, in the quiet town of Tokamura, Japan. Hisashi Uchi, Masato Shinohara, and Yutaka Yokokawa, workers at the local nuclear fuel plant, unknowingly triggered a catastrophic chain reaction that would alter their lives and the lives of many others forever. The events of the day seemed deceptively routine. 35-year-old Hisashi Uchi and 40-year-old Masato Shinohara, both technicians working at the plant, were preparing uranium-enriched fuel at the small facility in northeast Japan. Yutaka Yokokawa, their supervisor, was observing the procedure from his desk behind a wall about 14 feet away. The task itself was risky. The uranium they were handling was enriched to 18.8%, far higher than the usual 3 to 5%. Despite the potential dangers, the three workers had received no specialized training, and safety protocols were largely ignored. At 10:35 a.m., Uchi was leaning over the precipitation tank holding a funnel as Shinohara poured uranium oxide into the tank from a stainless steel bucket. This method had been adopted by the company, but without consulting safety specialists. Soon, the tank became overloaded with 35 pounds of uranium, far exceeding the 5-pound limit. Then, without warning, the tank emitted a blinding blue-white flash, signaling the start of a nuclear chain reaction. The men froze in shock for a moment, then fled the facility. The radiation began to spread almost immediately. Uchi and Shinohara began to feel nauseous, disoriented, and their skin burned with a searing pain. Though Yokokawa was farther away, he too began to feel the effects. The plant was evacuated, but radiation continued to leak, spreading into the surrounding area. Emergency protocols were slow to take effect. Hours passed before authorities evacuated 161 residents living nearby, while thousands were told to stay indoors. By the time the reaction was halted 20 hours later, Over 10,000 people were tested for radiation exposure, with hundreds suffering from dangerous levels of contamination. For Uchi, the nightmare was just beginning. Standing closest to the tank, he absorbed a devastating dose of 17 sieverts of radiation, a dose far above the fatal threshold of 4 or 5. His body was burned beyond recognition, his skin began to peel away, and his immune system collapsed. Despite the doctor's efforts with experimental stem cell transplants, skin grafts, and blood transfusions, nothing could stop the damage. Uchi's suffering was unimaginable. For 83 days, his organs failed one after another, and his body disintegrated before the eyes of medical staff and his family. Despite his condition, his family begged doctors to keep resuscitating him every time his heart stopped. The ethical questions surrounding his prolonged suffering were debated, but he ultimately passed away on December 21, 1999. Shinohara, who had been standing beside Uchi during the accident, suffered a similar fate. Although exposed to a slightly lower dose of 10 sieverts, his body began to fail. Radiation destroyed his organs, and after months of battling the inevitable, he succumbed to multiple organ failure in April 2000, nearly 7 months after the incident. Yokokawa, further from the explosion, was exposed to a lower dose of 3 sieverts. Though he survived, he spent months hospitalized, battling radiation sickness. Upon his recovery, he was charged with negligence, alongside 5 other employees, for their roles in the disaster. The plant's owners were forced to pay millions in compensation to local residents, many of whom had been exposed to excess radiation. In total, over 10,000 people were tested for radiation exposure. The disaster led to a nationwide re-evaluation of Japan's nuclear safety regulations, leaving a lasting mark on the industry. It was September 9, 2015. The morning air in Łódź, Poland carried the familiar hum of industrial machinery as workers began their shifts at the city's largest textile manufacturing complex. What should have been a routine tour would become one of the most horrific industrial accidents ever broadcasted live. The tour was airing live on a business-focused television program, broadcast in real time from the factory floor. Piotr Lewandowski was a 38-year-old marketing consultant turned TV personality entrepreneur. Despite having no manufacturing experience beyond a few marketing contracts with industrial clients, he confidently featured factory tours as content that would demystify modern production for small business owners. Colleagues who knew him from his consulting days later described him as routinely dismissive of operational safety concerns. He'd convinced the factory management to allow filming during active production hours, arguing that authentic footage required real working conditions, a decision later cited as a policy exception and enforcement failure. Textile manufacturing involves massive looms operating at high speeds, with fabric moving through complex roller systems. Safety zones are clearly marked with yellow paint and warning signs, creating buffer areas around equipment that can catch loose clothing or body parts in milliseconds. Piotr had arranged to film during peak production hours, specifically for dramatic effect, dismissing the plant manager's suggestion to tour during maintenance periods. The factory supervisor had explicitly noted that lockout and tagout would not be performed, and access was visual only. But Piotr waved off the concerns, claiming his audience needed real industrial atmosphere. He wore a loose button-down shirt, despite being advised to change into fitted clothing, insisting his professional appearance was essential for credibility. Piotr positioned himself next to a massive industrial loom to explain fabric production speeds to viewers. Yellow warning lines clearly marked the danger zone around the machinery, but Piotr stepped beyond them to keep the equipment in frame behind him. His camera operator, a freelancer hired for the day, also crossed the line in violation of site rules, following his movements without questioning the positioning. The loom's massive rollers spun at full speed just 3 feet away, processing cotton fabric in continuous sheets. As Piotr gestured toward the machinery while speaking to his camera, his loose shirt sleeve brushed against the loom's intake roller. The fabric caught instantly, and in less than 1 second, the machinery pulled his entire arm into the mechanism. Piotr was yanked forward violently, his shoulder dislocated as parts of his torso twisted against the machine's frame. The camera fell to the concrete floor, but continued transmitting live. capturing audio of emergency alarms and machinery noise echoing across the factory floor. The live feed was cut moments later from the control room, as supervisors realized the severity of what viewers were witnessing. Workers reacted immediately, cutting power via the emergency controls, though the machinery's momentum kept it moving briefly. The supervisor dialed for help, and the paramedics arrived 15 minutes later. By then, Piotr had already sustained non-survivable injuries and was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner's report determined death resulted from traumatic crush injuries and massive blood loss. The textile factory entered bankruptcy protection and later restructured following lawsuits, regulatory scrutiny, and sustained negative publicity after the incident. It was October 14, 2018, when 3 years of neighborhood harassment reached its deadly conclusion on a quiet Sunday afternoon, as what began as a property dispute between neighbors escalated into unthinkable violence that would shatter 2 families forever. Sarah Mitchell, 34, was a devoted mother of 2 young children who had endured relentless bullying from her next-door neighbor, Tessa Monroe, 41. What started as complaints about Sarah's children playing too loudly had evolved into a systematic campaign of psychological warfare that included false police reports, deliberate property damage, and increasingly threatening behavior towards Sarah's family. Tessa, a bitter divorcee who worked nights as a security guard, seemed to take perverse pleasure in tormenting the Mitchell family. Her own life had fallen apart after a messy divorce that left her financially struggling and emotionally unstable. She had called Child Protective Services multiple times with fabricated abuse allegations, forcing Sarah to endure humiliating investigations that found no evidence of wrongdoing. The harassment escalated when Tessa began targeting the family pets. She had poisoned their beloved golden retriever, Max, with antifreeze, claiming the dog was too noisy when it barked at strangers. The veterinary bills had cost the Mitchells over $3,000, and Max barely survived the poisoning. That Sunday afternoon, Sarah was tending to her vegetable garden while her 6-year-old daughter Emma played on the swing set. The October air was crisp and peaceful, with colorful leaves scattered across the yard. Tessa emerged from her house in a rage, still wearing her security guard uniform from the previous night's shift. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep and alcohol consumption. She began screaming at Emma, claiming the child's laughter was disturbing her sleep and threatening to call the police if the noise didn't stop immediately. When Sarah intervened, rushing to protect her daughter, Tessa escalated the confrontation by threatening to make the whole family disappear and claiming she had connections who could take care of problems like them. The threat was delivered with such venom that Sarah genuinely feared for her family's safety. Emma began crying and ran to hide behind her mother, trembling with fear. The argument moved to the front yard where other neighbors began watching from their windows, some recording the confrontation on their phones. Tessa, emboldened by the audience, grabbed Sarah's garden hose and began spraying both Sarah and Emma with freezing water, soaking their clothes and causing Emma to scream in shock and cold. Sarah, overwhelmed by 3 years of torment and seeing her daughter being physically assaulted, pushed Tessa away from them with both hands. The force was not excessive, but Tessa, who had been drinking and was unsteady on her feet, stumbled backward and fell, striking her head on the sharp concrete edge of her driveway with a sickening crack. The impact caused a severe concussion and immediate brain swelling. Tessa lost consciousness instantly and began having violent seizures, her body convulsing uncontrollably as blood seeped from her head wound onto the concrete. Sarah, overwhelmed by 3 years of psychological torture and seeing her traumatized daughter, made a split-second decision that would haunt her forever. Instead of immediately calling 911, she took Emma inside their house and waited 15 crucial minutes before calling emergency services, claiming she had just discovered her neighbor unconscious after an apparent fall. Tessa died from her brain injuries before paramedics could save her. The delayed emergency response proved critical. Medical experts later testified that immediate treatment could have prevented her death, as the brain swelling could have been controlled with rapid intervention. It was February 18, 2017, when 26-year-old Holly Barrett began her shift at the food processing facility during a critical sanitation cycle. Known for her thorough attention to cleanliness standards, Holly had worked as a sanitation specialist for 4 years. Her colleagues respected her dedication to food safety protocols and willingness to tackle challenging cleaning tasks. Marco DeLuca, a methodical 39-year-old maintenance technician and lockout advocate, handled a separate repair nearby. Janelle Porter, an exacting 34-year-old quality inspector, conducted mid-shift contamination swabs throughout the area. Omar Wells, a schedule-driven 50-year-old line supervisor, coordinated sanitation cycles between batching runs. A horizontal mixer with rotating paddle shafts required thorough cleaning to remove residue from the previous batch. The equipment's guard panel had been removed during troubleshooting and awaited reinstallation after cleaning. This created an open access point to the mixer's internal mechanisms. The written lockout procedure was posted at the control panel, but documentation had not been completed when cleaning began. The mixer's jog mode remained active from prior maintenance checks, with a status light indicating power was available at the drive motor. Communication between sanitation and maintenance teams remained informal without formal coordination of energy isolation. No lockout device had been applied at the electrical disconnect, leaving the equipment energized during cleaning operations. Tools and cleaning rags were positioned at the open hopper for easy access. The emergency stop button functioned properly during testing, but was not treated as adequate energy isolation for personnel protection during maintenance activities. Holly positioned herself on a step stool to gain access to the mixer chamber interior. She reached into the confined space to wipe residue from the paddle surfaces, focusing on areas requiring detailed manual cleaning to meet sanitation standards. A co-worker at the control panel initiated a brief jog cycle to reposition the paddles for better cleaning access, unaware that Holly's hand remained inside the mixer chamber. The communication breakdown proved fatal as the paddle began rotating without warning. The rotating paddle caught Holly's protective glove at a pinch point between the paddle edge and mixer housing. The inward draw occurred rapidly as her upper extremities were pulled into the rotating mechanism before the panel operator could hit the emergency stop. The machine continued coasting briefly after the stop was pressed due to rotational momentum. The paddle assembly ceased rotation within seconds, but damage had already occurred during initial contact and entanglement. Colleagues immediately activated emergency response and retrieved the trauma kit. Power was cut at the main disconnect to ensure no further equipment movement. Guards were positioned to prevent additional contact, while responders were directed to the mixing room. Clinical findings revealed catastrophic traumatic injuries to the upper extremities, with rapid blood loss that proved non-survivable. Holly was declared deceased at the scene despite immediate emergency response efforts. Investigation identified critical failures: absence of proper lockout during sanitation, exposed moving parts during cleaning, and jog mode use without confirmed personnel clearance from hazardous areas. Corrective actions included mandatory lockout with group locks for sanitation activities, interlock systems disabling jog mode when guards are removed, and two-person verification for energy isolation. Additional controls included visual hands-clear beacons at control panels, lock caddies at each line, and enhanced communication protocols between maintenance and sanitation teams. Training emphasized zero energy state verification and dangers of equipment coast-to-stop periods that can cause injury even after emergency stops are activated. It was January 15, 2017, and the harsh Chicago winter had transformed Metropolitan General Hospital into a fortress against the brutal cold that gripped the city. Inside the emergency department, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the linoleum floors, as medical staff battled an overwhelming surge of patients suffering from a severe flu outbreak that had pushed the facility beyond its limits. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the tension that permeated every corner of the understaffed department. Patricia Williams checked her watch as she hurried between patient rooms. Her scrubs wrinkled from the 16 consecutive hours she had been on duty. At 29, the dedicated emergency room nurse had built a reputation for her exceptional clinical skills and unwavering compassion, even during the most chaotic shifts. Her colleagues relied on her steady presence and encyclopedic knowledge of emergency protocols, qualities that made her indispensable during the current crisis. The flu outbreak had overwhelmed Chicago's healthcare system, with emergency departments across the city reporting patient volumes 300% above normal capacity. Metropolitan General's administration had refused to hire temporary nursing staff despite the crisis, instead mandating overtime for existing employees who were already exhausted from weeks of double shifts. Patricia had been working without adequate rest for days, surviving on coffee and determination. Patricia's supervisor had repeatedly asked her to extend her shift as colleagues called in sick or simply couldn't continue working. Her natural instinct to help others made it impossible for her to leave when patients were suffering, even though she recognized the dangerous level of exhaustion that was affecting her judgment and physical coordination. She had expressed concerns about patient safety due to inadequate staffing levels, but management dismissed her warnings. The emergency department on January 15th resembled a war zone more than a medical facility, with patients on gurneys lining the hallways and family members crowding every available space. Patricia moved between critical cases with practiced efficiency, her years of experience allowing her to prioritize care even as new patients arrived faster than they could be treated. As Patricia responded to a cardiac arrest call in room 12, she felt a sudden tightness in her chest that she initially attributed to the stress and physical demands of her extended shift. The sensation intensified as she hurried down the corridor, her vision beginning to blur as her heart struggled to maintain its rhythm under the extreme stress of prolonged exhaustion. Patricia collapsed suddenly in the hospital corridor, her body hitting the linoleum floor with a sound that echoed through the emergency department. Colleagues who had been working alongside her for hours initially thought she had simply tripped, but quickly realized she was experiencing a severe medical emergency, as her breathing became labored and irregular. Despite being surrounded by some of Chicago's most skilled emergency medical professionals, Patricia went into cardiac arrest and could not be revived. The irony of losing a dedicated healthcare worker in the very department where she had saved countless lives was not lost on her colleagues. Patricia Williams was pronounced dead at 3:47 a.m. from a massive heart attack brought on by extreme exhaustion and stress. The hospital faced intense scrutiny over working conditions and mandatory overtime policies. Patricia's death sparked nationwide conversations about nurse burnout and patient safety. It was October 11th, 2012, in Santa Fe Springs, California. Jose Molina, a 62-year-old worker at Bumblebee Foods, began his shift like any other. His job required him to oversee the preparation of pallets of canned tuna for processing. Jose was well known for his reliability and commitment to his role at the plant, having spent years working there. On that day, he followed his usual routine without any indication that things would soon take a tragic turn. The plant's work environment was hazardous. It involved handling large industrial ovens, each one about 35 feet long, capable of reaching temperatures of 270 degrees Fahrenheit. These ovens were crucial to the tuna processing operation, but they were also dangerous. For Jose, the ovens were a regular part of his work. On this day, however, he unknowingly became part of a deadly mistake. At some point during the morning, Jose entered one of the ovens for routine maintenance. While he was inside, one of his co-workers, thinking Jose was on break, began loading the oven with 6 tons of canned tuna. The oven doors were sealed, and the machine was activated. The temperature inside started to rise, and by the time anyone realized Jose was missing, it was already too late. A search ensued, but it wasn't until 2 hours later that they discovered his body inside the now-cooled oven. The tragedy, though sudden and harrowing, revealed a disturbing lack of safety measures at Bumblebee Foods. Investigations uncovered significant lapses in the plant's protocols. There were no checks in place to ensure that the ovens were empty before they were loaded or turned on. No system was in place to monitor when workers entered these dangerous areas, and there were no safeguards, such as designated spotters or an escape mechanism. The absence of such basic measures proved to be fatal for Jose. Deputy District Attorney Hoon Chun, who oversaw the case, described the incident as one of the most heartbreaking he had encountered. He emphasized the unimaginable suffering Jose may have endured in those final moments. This case underscored the need for accountability and workplace safety. Bumblebee Foods faced serious legal consequences. The company was found guilty of breaching occupational safety standards and pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor for failing to establish effective safety protocols. As a result, Bumblebee Foods was ordered to pay a historic $6 million settlement, the largest penalty ever imposed in California for a workplace safety violation. This fine reflected the severity of the incident, far surpassing standard penalties. Two key employees, Plant Operations Director Angel Rodriguez and former safety manager Saul Flores, also faced penalties. Rodriguez, who pled guilty to a misdemeanor charge, was sentenced to community service and fined around $1,000. Flores, however, pled guilty to a felony charge and was sentenced to probation, along with fines of approximately $119,000. Both men had initially faced more severe penalties, including potential prison time. The company's response included a commitment to safety reforms. Bumblebee Foods invested $3 million to upgrade their ovens and prevent similar accidents from occurring. Additional employee training programs were implemented to ensure workers understood and followed the necessary safety protocols. These efforts were a direct response to the glaring safety oversights that had led to Jose's death. Jose's family was awarded $1.5 million as part of the settlement. While the amount could never replace what was lost, it provided some small measure of relief. His wife, children, and colleagues were left to mourn a tragedy that could have been prevented with better oversight. The incident also revealed that Bumblebee Foods had been previously cited by California's Occupational Safety and Health Administration for inadequate safety measures. In 2011, the company had been fined $74,000 for these issues, but the necessary changes were never made in time to prevent Jose's death. In the aftermath, Bumblebee Foods issued a statement expressing its commitment to prioritizing safety. They acknowledged Jose's death as a painful reminder of the importance of maintaining strict safety protocols in the workplace. It was July 18, 2017. The medieval towers of Banska Štiavniča's historic castle complex cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as afternoon tourists wandered through centuries-old corridors. Roman Hruška had discovered his passion for Slovak medieval history 3 years earlier. What began as weekend castle visits evolved into the 46-year-old's appearances on local TV and occasional regional broadcasts where he conducted walking tours for viewers across Europe. The segment that afternoon was airing live on regional television, broadcast in real time from the castle grounds. His insurance background gave him an eye for structural details, but his enthusiasm often overrode caution. Roman's signature move involved physically touching ancient walls and leaning against historical features to create intimate connections with the past for his audience. Medieval castles present unique hazards for modern visitors. Stone structures built centuries ago lack contemporary safety standards, with narrow passages, uneven surfaces, and deteriorating wooden elements that may appear solid, but are weakened over decades. That afternoon, Roman had convinced a security guard to allow him brief access to the castle's upper balcony, a section normally locked to public tours due to ongoing structural assessments. The wooden railing system dated to the 19th century and showed visible weathering, but Roman dismissed concerns as bureaucratic overcaution. He told his cameraman he wanted to show the panoramic view from the balcony's edge. Weather reports indicated recent heavy rains had saturated the region, potentially affecting wooden structures, but Roman and the crew were unaware of this. Roman positioned himself against the balcony's wooden railing, addressing his audience during a live broadcast while gesturing toward the courtyard below. He leaned backward against the barrier for dramatic effect, explaining the castle's defensive architecture to his engaged audience. The weathered railing fasteners began to pull free from their anchors under repeated pressure, creaking ominously. But Roman ignored the warning sounds, continuing his presentation while applying increasing force to the compromised railing system. And then, the wooden barrier gave way unevenly, the post pulling free from its anchors. Roman's full weight had been resting against the compromised railing when it failed, sending him tumbling backward into empty air, dropping nearly 40 feet. His body striking the stone courtyard with devastating force. Tourists in the courtyard screamed as Roman's chest hit the cobblestones first, followed by his head. The transmission ended abruptly moments later. A nearby tourist contacted emergency services, while onlookers remained with Roman until responders arrived. 12 minutes later, paramedics arrived and found that the injuries were fatal. The coroner's report determined Roman died from massive blunt force trauma. The castle immediately closed the upper sections for comprehensive structural review, discovering multiple areas with compromised wooden elements and conducting an investigation into the guard's temporary access decision. The investigation resulted in the guard being fired for granting access in violation of safety protocols. It was December 9, 2015, at a middle school in Carmel, Indiana. After 4:30 p.m., the building had mostly emptied, leaving only a few staff members finishing end-of-semester tasks, while hallway cameras continued recording every entry and exit for later review. Among the remaining teachers was Harold Harlan, 44, who had spent 14 years teaching 7th grade American history. His classroom was known for rigid discipline and public shaming. He routinely read failing grades aloud, assigned detention for minor behavior, and kept detailed records that parents later described as humiliating. Multiple complaints were filed, but internal reviews found no policy violations, as district anti-bullying rules applied only to students, not teachers. Detention took place in room 127, a former storage room off the main hallway. The space had no windows, a single inward opening door, and relied entirely on the building's central ventilation. It held a few desks, a teacher's table, and metal cabinets occasionally used to store custodial supplies. Policy required the supervising teacher to stay inside with the student, leaving both alone in an enclosed room with little oversight. That afternoon, Harlan assigned detention to Zayden Webb, a 13-year-old student who had received repeated detention since the start of the school year. Webb had been singled out frequently in class, mocked for poor scores, and once kept after school for nearly an hour longer than required, according to later statements from classmates. Security footage showed Webb entering room 127 at 3:45 p.m. and leaving at 4:15 p.m. after signing out. Later footage showed Harlan entering the room at 4:18 p.m. and never exiting. What investigators later uncovered filled in what the cameras could not. Earlier that week, Webb had accessed a custodial supply area and removed a bottle of muriatic acid used for restroom cleaning. During detention, he poured the chemical into an open container inside room 127 and damaged the door handle mechanism using a small tool from his backpack. He then sealed the container inside a cabinet and left the room, knowing Harlan often stayed behind to work alone. At 4:18 p.m., Harlan re-entered the room with papers and a laptop. As the room sat closed, hydrochloric acid vapors slowly filled the space. With no windows and limited airflow, the fumes intensified. Harlan began coughing and experienced rapid throat and lung irritation. As he tried to escape, the damaged door hardware failed. Scratch marks later found on the door, and walls showed repeated attempts to force it open. The acid burned his face, neck, and hands as he struggled to breathe. He collapsed beside his desk as oxygen deprivation worsened. At 5:47 p.m., custodian James Torres noticed a sharp chemical odor in the hallway and traced it to room 127. Inside, he found Harlan unresponsive and immediately called emergency services as hallway cameras continued recording the first responders entering the room. Responders arrived minutes later but were unable to revive him. The medical examiner ruled the death an acute respiratory failure caused by prolonged exposure to hydrochloric acid vapors with severe internal and external chemical burns. Investigators later determined the act was deliberate. Webb admitted he wanted Harlan to feel trapped, citing months of public humiliation and fear. He was adjudicated delinquent for an act equivalent to murder and sentenced to confinement in a state juvenile facility until age 21. The school permanently closed room 127, revised detention policies to require multiple staff, and removed chemical storage from instructional areas. It was July 23, 2018, when 33-year-old Danielle Foster responded to urgent reports of a pump blockage at the municipal wastewater lift station. An experienced maintenance technician with 8 years in utilities, Danielle was known for her quick problem-solving abilities and dedication to preventing service disruptions. The afternoon brought critical reports of pump blockage threatening upstream backups into a residential neighborhood. Time pressure mounted as complaints from affected residents increased, demanding immediate attention to prevent sewage overflows. Sam Rivera, an organized 29-year-old maintenance helper, was on hand to provide confined space support. Colleen Myers, an efficient 41-year-old contractor, coordinated blockage removal downstream. Dana Kim, a calm 36-year-old dispatcher, managed emergency calls from operations. Several equipment deficiencies created dangerous conditions. The portable ventilation blower was in the truck with a maintenance note indicating intermittent operation and no replacement obtained. The multi-gas atmospheric monitor displayed a low battery indicator, while the charging cradle was occupied by another crew's equipment. The retrieval tripod and winch were available near the truck, but remained unrigged during initial assessment. A confined space permit form was started but left incomplete, with attendant and entrant roles not formally assigned. The odor of sewage was particularly strong at the access hatch. Wind direction carried hazardous vapors directly toward the entry point, concentrating dangerous gases around the confined space entrance. Danielle opened the access hatch and descended the fixed ladder with the gas detector clipped to her chest. The detector functioned despite the low battery warning, providing some atmospheric monitoring capability. The gas detector alarm activated shortly after entry into the below-grade wet well. Alarm tones were audible to surface personnel, but specific gas concentration readings were not communicated to the support team above. Within moments of reaching the lower ladder rungs, Danielle lost normal posture and became motionless while positioned on the ladder. The rapid onset suggested exposure to high concentrations of hydrogen sulfide gas. Sam moved to assist without donning respiratory protection. He began descending but quickly retreated while coughing as continuous alarm tones indicated dangerous atmospheric conditions persisted. Colleen called emergency services and directed bystanders away from the hazardous area. The retrieval tripod was moved into position, but had not been rigged with the winch system for emergency extraction. Fire department rescue personnel arrived with self-contained breathing apparatus. A trained rescuer entered the space, attached the winch line to Danielle's harness, and completed vertical extraction to the surface. Emergency responders immediately initiated high-flow oxygen and advanced life support protocols. The ventilation blower was connected to purge dangerous gases, with atmospheric readings gradually returning to safe levels. Clinical findings revealed fatal hydrogen sulfide poisoning, with rapid respiratory paralysis and resultant severe hypoxia. High gas concentrations caused immediate incapacitation and respiratory failure that proved non-survivable despite prompt rescue efforts. Investigation identified critical failures: incomplete permit documentation, lack of continuous atmospheric monitoring with confirmed safe readings, and attempted rescue without proper respiratory protection. Corrective measures included mandatory continuous ventilation before entry, fully charged detectors with bump testing, tripod pre-rigging before opening spaces, and designated attendant roles with radio communication. Additional controls included hydrogen sulfide training, rescue practice with mannequins, and mandatory supervisor sign-off before confined space entry. Nearby stations underwent safety audits for similar deficiencies. It was June 4, 2013, and the Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the massive distribution warehouse in Phoenix, transforming the 800,000-square-foot facility into a furnace that trapped heat like an oven. Inside, the temperature had climbed to 105 degrees as workers moved through towering storage areas that reached 40 feet high, their movements creating the only breeze in the stifling environment. The smell of cardboard and plastic mixed with the oppressive heat that made every breath feel like inhaling fire. Robert Kim wiped sweat from his forehead as he maneuvered his forklift through the narrow aisles between storage racks, his uniform soaked through despite the early morning hour. At 26, the hard-working warehouse employee had become skilled at operating the heavy machinery required to manage inventory in the facility's towering storage system. His steady income from the distribution center supported his young family, including his wife Sarah and their 3-year-old daughter Emma, who depended on his dedication to provide for their future. The warehouse had been experiencing record-breaking heat waves throughout the summer, with outdoor temperatures exceeding 115 degrees and indoor conditions becoming increasingly dangerous for workers. Management had been cutting operational costs by reducing air conditioning usage and limiting break times during peak shipping season, arguing that the facility's size made climate control prohibitively expensive. Robert had complained about the dangerous working conditions to his supervisors, expressing concern that the extreme heat was affecting workers' ability to operate heavy machinery safely. His requests for additional breaks and improved ventilation had been dismissed as complaints from workers trying to avoid their responsibilities. The fear of losing his job in a competitive market kept Robert from pushing too hard for changes, even as he recognized the growing danger. The morning shift on June 4th began with temperatures already approaching dangerous levels, as Robert and his colleagues prepared for another day of moving inventory through the sweltering warehouse. Supervisors had been pressuring workers to maintain productivity despite the extreme conditions, threatening disciplinary action for anyone who couldn't keep up with the demanding pace. As Robert operated his forklift at a height of 25 feet, retrieving inventory from the upper storage racks, he began showing obvious signs of heat exhaustion. His movements became sluggish and uncoordinated, and colleagues noticed him struggling to maintain his balance on the elevated platform. The combination of extreme heat and physical exertion had pushed his body beyond its limits. Robert's condition deteriorated rapidly as heat strokes set in, causing confusion and loss of motor control that made operating the heavy machinery extremely dangerous. Despite his obvious distress, supervisors continued to pressure him to complete his assigned tasks, unwilling to lose productivity during the busy shipping period. Robert collapsed while operating the forklift at full height, his unconscious body causing the vehicle to tip over as it lost control. The forklift crashed to the warehouse floor with tremendous force, crushing Robert beneath the 9,000-pound machine as his horrified co-workers rushed to help. The combination of heat stroke and crushing injuries proved immediately fatal. Robert Kim was pronounced dead at the scene, his body temperature having reached 108 degrees. OSHA investigators found the warehouse had violated numerous heat safety regulations and worker protection standards. The incident exposed widespread abuse of warehouse workers in extreme temperature conditions across the industry. New federal regulations were implemented requiring climate control and mandatory rest periods in extreme heat, with Robert's case becoming a rallying point for labor unions advocating for stronger worker protections. It was June 15, 2024, in Zakho, Iraq's Duhok Governorate District. The morning in this bustling town, known for its landmarks like Dalal Bridge and Zakho Castle, began like any other. Isa Ismail, a 25-year-old chef and father of 3, was preparing for a busy day at the Hazel Hall. With 8 years of experience, Isa had gained a reputation for his culinary skills, particularly in catering for weddings and events that marked significant moments in the community. On that day, Isa was focused on preparing a large pot of chicken soup, a dish often served at gatherings. The kitchen, a familiar place of organized chaos, hummed with activity as Isa worked alongside his co-workers. But as he moved across the busy space, a slip on the floor turned into a catastrophic accident. Isa fell directly into the large pot of boiling soup that had been placed on the ground. The liquid, scalding at over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, engulfed his body, causing burns over 70% of his skin. Despite the excruciating pain, Isa pulled himself from the pot, collapsing onto the cold kitchen floor. His co-workers rushed to his aid, calling for an ambulance and doing their best to comfort him in the panic. The severity of his injuries left them helpless, and Isa was quickly transported to a hospital 40 miles away in Duhok. There, doctors worked tirelessly to treat the critical burns, but the extent of the damage was too severe to reverse. After 5 days in intensive care, Isa succumbed to his injuries on June 21, 2024. The news of Isa's death shocked his family and community. His father, Muhammad Ismail, and his relative, Zervan Hosni, spoke out, sharing their grief and describing Issa as a loving father who worked tirelessly to provide for his family, despite earning only 25,000 Iraqi dinars a day, around $17. Issa's dedication to his work had supported his wife and 3 children. His sudden passing left a financial and emotional gap that would be difficult to overcome. The tragedy sparked outrage across Iraqi media and social platforms, with many criticizing the lack of safety regulations in commercial kitchens. The common practice of placing large hot pots on the floor was seen as a significant risk, one that had ultimately led to Issa's death. This incident brought attention to the urgent need for improved safety measures in workplaces, particularly in kitchens where employees work under hazardous conditions. Zakho, known for its landmarks and its position as a center of job opportunities in the Kurdistan Autonomous Region, had attracted many seeking work, but Issa's death revealed the dangers workers often face when safety protocols are either ignored or poorly enforced. His tragic accident highlighted the overlooked risks in industries that rely on routine tasks with little regard for worker safety. The incident also drew comparisons to other famous cases involving burns from hot liquids, such as the widely known case of Stella Liebeck, who sued McDonald's after suffering burns from a spilled cup of hot coffee. Both incidents underscored the hidden dangers of handling high-temperature substances and the need for better precautionary measures. Issa Ismail's death serves as a stark reminder of the risks involved in routine tasks when safety is neglected. His dedication to his work and his family's well-being made him a beloved figure in his community. His story continues to fuel conversations about improving workplace safety, with the hope that no one else will suffer the same fate. It was November 22nd, 2013. The morning air at Valparaiso's main shipyard carried the familiar scent of salt and diesel fuel, while workers made final preparations for the ceremonial launch of a 180-foot cargo vessel, unaware that the day's routine would become someone's last assignment. Diego Rojas, a 35-year-old correspondent, had built his reputation live covering Chile's maritime industry for 8 years. The launch coverage that morning was airing live on regional television, broadcast in real time from the shipyard. His colleagues at the television station respected his technical knowledge and fearless approach to getting dramatic footage. Diego specialized in maritime launches, understanding the complex engineering behind moving massive vessels from dry dock to water using gravity, grease, and precisely calculated momentum. Ship launches require vessels weighing hundreds of tons to slide down angled rails into water, with timing and positioning critical to prevent catastrophic accidents during the uncontrolled descent. Diego's confidence around ships had earned him exclusive access to restricted areas that other journalists couldn't reach. His editor had specifically requested close-up footage of the hull entering water for their evening maritime segment. Previous launches had made Diego somewhat complacent about safety protocols, often positioning himself closer to the action than harbor officials recommended. He'd covered dozens of similar ceremonies without incident, likely developing an almost casual attitude toward the inherent dangers. That morning, shipyard engineers had miscalculated the friction coefficients on the launching rails due to recent rainfall that had washed away protective grease. The 400-ton vessel was expected to descend at a controlled pace, but reduced friction caused it to accelerate far faster than engineers anticipated. Harbor officials issued standard safety warnings to media personnel, establishing a 50-foot exclusion zone around the launch area. Diego entered the exclusion zone against explicit warning. His cameraman later stated that Diego dismissed the precautions as overly conservative, having witnessed similar launches from closer distances. Once the blocks were released, no emergency mechanism could stop the vessel's momentum. Diego positioned himself directly between the concrete quay and the ship's hull, seeking dramatic angles that would capture the vessel's massive scale as it entered the water. His cameraman warned him about the tight space, but Diego insisted the footage would be worth the risk. At 11:45 in the morning, the ceremonial bottle broke against the bow, and workers released the restraining blocks. The ship began its descent faster than anyone anticipated. Within seconds, the accelerating hull pinned Diego against the concrete quay, compressing his torso under immense weight. His chest suffered massive compression, his ribcage crushed inward and internal organs severely damaged, while the hull continued its momentum for several seconds before settling into the water. Diego was incapacitated instantly. Survival under the 400-ton load was impossible. Workers at the shipyard called for help without delay, though paramedics arrived 12 minutes afterward to discover Diego had already died. The brief live broadcast later became crucial evidence in the subsequent safety investigation. The coroner determined multiple internal organs were severely damaged by the crushing force, consistent with unsurvivable injuries. The Maritime Authority conducted an investigation into how media personnel and Diego were allowed into the hazard area. Diego's funeral drew hundreds of dock workers and journalists who remembered his dedication to maritime reporting.